Game 1 of the 1987 NLCS started off as a great pitcher's duel. Like so many Cardinals games from this era, this one was all about small ball. And Giants starter Rick Russell cruised through the Cardinals order the first 2 times. But then came the third time through the order, and as you probably already know, that didn't work out so well. Well, the first warning sign was this long fly ball by Tom Herr. It came within a few feet of being a home run. And then came a double by Dan Driesen. Willie McGee advanced the runner on an absolutely bizarre play. And then came this pool table shot base hit, and that's the one that got the Cardinals rolling. In fact, even the Cardinals pitcher got in on the act. St. Louis scored 3 runs in that inning, romping to a fairly easy victory in an otherwise close game. But the craziest thing about this game was not that comeback. No, it's the fact that Giants manager Roger Craig really should have known to expect this. Now, I will admit, back in 1987, this wasn't really all that well known. But the truth is that Rick Russell was yet another victim of what we call third time through the order syndrome. Don't believe me? Well, let's look at the stats. So in the National League in 1987, batters had an OPS, that's on-base percentage plus slugging percentage, of 706 their first time through the order. The second time through, this increased to 722. And then came the third time through the order when that OPS increased to 800. Let me put this to you in terms that you might be a little bit more familiar with. So the first time through the order, hitters had a 250 batting average. By the third time through, however, that average had jumped up to 283. In other words, batters hit like Ken Oberkfell the first time through the order. His OPS was 704 in 1987. By the time you got to the third time through the order, the average hitter was hitting like Ryne Sandberg, who had an OPS of 809 that year. Or to put this a little bit more bluntly, the average hitter went from being a marginal major league hitter to being an all-star. And all of this is only because the starting pitcher stayed in there. And this isn't just a 1987 thing. In 2024, for example, hitters had a 696 OPS their first time against the starter. By time number 3, that increased to a whopping 761. This isn't just a modern thing either. Back in 1970, hitters went from having a 675 OPS the first time against the pitcher to a 742 OPS the third time, and then a 775 OPS the fourth time. This was 1970. Again, this was 1970. This is the year that starters completed about 22% of their starts. Well, you wonder how anybody would complete a start with hitting numbers like that, and it's all because the pitcher stayed in. I'll give you an example. On September 9th, 1970, the Phillies were at Shea for a doubleheader. Nolan Ryan started the first game. Ryan pitched well through 8 innings, giving up only 2 runs. But in the 9th, the Phillies got to him as he went through the middle of the order for a 4th time. And this was Nolan Ryan. This is the man notorious for being able to finish ball games. Even if you look at his splits, you'll see that he suffered from third time through the order syndrome. Well, it seems like a sure thing, right? Go all the way back to 1970 and you will still see the pattern. In fact, if you keep going back in baseball history, the pattern holds. Well, it holds up until you get to a certain point. For instance, take a look at the stats for 1955. The syndrome is there, sure, but you're only seeing a jump from a 692 OPS to a 744 OPS the third time around. That's a lot less severe than what we just looked at. And if you look at 1932, the OPS goes down. Goes down from 736 the second time through to 734 the third time through. Okay, think about that for a minute. In 1932, pitchers pitched better the third time through the order. And just wait, it gets even more confusing from there. In 1927, the second and third times through the order were basically indistinguishable. Hitters had a 731 OPS the second time through and a 734 OPS the third time through. And in 1916, things were even stranger. That year, the OPS went from 629 the first time through down to 623 the second time through, only to rebound up slightly to 639 the third time through. 1912 is the oldest season that baseball references this kind of data for. That year, the third time through the order resulted in a 688 OPS, which was lower than the 693 OPS the first time through. Okay, so what do we have here? Well, for more recent seasons, and going all the way back at least to 1955, there is a third time through the order syndrome. However, for the more distant past seasons, it just doesn't exist. But why? I mean, were the pitchers Supermen back then? Well, I don't really think so. In fact, I think that there's a pretty simple explanation for all of this that most people have overlooked. So let's dig in. Well, on July 16th, 1912, the Boston Red Sox hosted the Detroit Tigers. This was a Tuesday game, and it started at 3:15 p.m. On Friday, June 10th, 1932, the New York Giants hosted the Cincinnati Reds. That game started at 3:15 p.m. 5 minutes later, over at Ebbets Field, the Brooklyn Dodgers hosted the Chicago Cubs, starting time 3:20 p.m. My point is that baseball games started later in the period before there were lights. That's right. Day games that started before, say, 1935 tended to start later than they did afterwards when there were light structures built. It was common back then for day games to start at 3:15 p.m. local time or 3:30 p.m. local time, or sometimes as late as 4 p.m. or later. This was especially common before World War I. And as you can guess, those hitters had to deal with the late afternoon shadows, especially late in the ball game. There were absolutely no lights to help them. And so on Saturday, May 1st, 1920, the Boston Braves hosted the Brooklyn Dodgers. This game started at 3 p.m. even though it was a Saturday. Nobody thought of maybe bumping up the starting time to 1. As you probably already know, that was the date of the infamous 26-inning tie ball game. Leon Cador went the distance for Brooklyn, all 26 innings. And Joe Ushker went the whole way for Boston, also pitching all 26 innings. The weather was overcast at the start of that one, but they played on until it was too dark to see. And of course, the hitters were hopeless to see the ball without lights. Well, even the double headers started later than you'd probably guess. The last place Boston Red Sox hosted the famous New York Yankees on Monday, September 5th, 1927 for a doubleheader. Now, the first game was an all-time classic. It was an 18-inning game that was finally won by the Red Sox 12-11. Even though that game didn't start until almost 6 p.m., they did manage to fit in 5 innings of the second game of the doubleheader, which the Yankees won 5-0. Now, I'm not entirely sure when the starting time of afternoon games was pushed forward, i.e. closer to like 2 p.m., 1:30 p.m., and so on. However, I'm pretty sure that this happened sometime in the late 1940s or maybe in some places in the early 1950s. For example, on Thursday, June 2nd, 1955, the Brooklyn Dodgers hosted the Boston Braves at Ebbets Field for a 1:30 p.m. start. The New York Giants were also at the Polo Grounds that day, hosting the Cincinnati Reds for another 1:30 p.m. game. Well, this is a part of baseball history that has been largely overlooked. It seems to me that it may have been easier for pitchers in the good old days to throw complete games, largely because the batters simply could not see the ball in the late afternoon. Remember again that there were no lights at all to help them. Now, this does make a difference for our baseball sims. I'm not aware of any sim that does third time through the order syndrome quite right. Most games have some sort of batter's face fatigue system or some sort of artificial pitch count system. And there are also obvious cross-era implications that this phenomenon causes. So for example, did Ed Walsh benefit from the late afternoon shadows when he won 40 games in 1908? If you took him out in 1908 and stuck him in, say, 1998, what difference would that do to his stamina? Well, I don't know of any good or easy answers to any of those questions, but I do know that this is something that is worth looking into. So let me know what you think.